Welcome back to another episode of Fine Margins. I'm Ben. I'm obviously joined with my co-host Bella. So a big topic in Formula One has been sustainability, with the introduction in 2026 of the carbon neutral fuel and the FIA's commitment to making the sport net zero by 2030. And we've talked about in previous episodes what F1 has been doing, honestly what they haven't been doing. But in today's episode, we're going to be looking at the individual teams that are doing it best, the ones that are the most sustainable, and the ones that are also the least. We'll be covering what they've been putting out, the goals that they've stated, and what they've actually achieved, and how it compares to one another. Bear in mind, this is all based on what is publicly available.
So the first team to kick off with, which probably will be the most surprising to be in the top 5, is Williams.
Yeah, so Williams is very surprising, firstly, because they are one of the least finance-backed teams in the world. They probably have the second smallest budget behind Haas. So they were awarded in August 2021 the 3-star certificate in the FIA's environmental accreditation program, which is the highest ranking you can get, and not every team has reached that ranking. And they've made a really kind of they've set a really important goal by 2030, and they want to be the first team that are carbon positive, not carbon neutral or carbon zero. So they actually want to take in more CO2 emissions than they actually put out, which is a very promising goal to have by 2030. So some of the steps that they've done to do that already is they've transitioned their headquarters to electricity generated from 100% carbon-free renewable sources with water-saving equipment installed across their sites. They've reduced single-use plastics, especially for their water dispensers. So each employee is given an aluminium bottle, and there's water sites where they can fill up their bottles, but there's no cups, plastics, anything along those lines. And they've stated things like freights and travels are made up a significant portion of the team's carbon emissions and are essential to their core activities. So they're introducing programs to reduce the amount of freight emissions, but that's currently under development because, as we stated in previous episodes, freight transport is the biggest emitter of carbon, taking teams and traveling them from country to country. And on top of that, all their equipment, the cars, that is what releases the most CO2 into the atmosphere. And so a couple goals that they've set up is, so by 2024, they want to reduce freight emissions by 15% compared to their 2021 baseline. By 2025, they want to eliminate 100% of natural gas emissions. It's now 8% of CO2. By 2024, their energy usage they want it to reduce by 10% based on their 2019 baselines. Their waste streams are reduced by 20% compared to their 2021 baseline. And the use of drinking water in irrigation and operational processing is reduced by 15% compared to their 2021 baseline. So firstly, they've achieved a lot already, and they have big goals. And Williams is actually, funny thing about Williams, they were the first team ever to kind of, in any sports or entertainment in 2009, to make the commitment over tackling climate change, which I find is very impressive. Out of all forms of sports and all forms of entertainment, Williams were the first to kind of make a big statement to reduce their carbon emission.
Yeah, crazy when you think it's not that any of this spending would be, factored into the budget cap, but it's the fact that they had no money to spend, and it means you're allocating people and time and resource to, covering things like this. So let's go to their UK-based counterpart, and of course, naturally leading with Toto Wolff, to Mercedes. So Mercedes are expected to be pretty good because when it comes to any big regulations or meeting some benchmarks, they tend to kind of sit quite highly, and they didn't disappoint. Their goal or ethos as a team in terms of their sustainability is to become the world's most sustainable sports team. Not their most sustainable F1 team, but the most sustainable sports team. And I would probably argue to an extent their money is where their mouth is. So what has their impact been? Well, their operations have been carbon neutral since 2020. Through both emissions reduction, but also offsetting. So they're actually reducing the emissions they're putting out, but they're also then, working with people like the Gold Standard to offset emissions that they can't necessarily control. Their factory at Brackley uses 100% renewable energy and has done so since 2019, earlier than most teams. And their goal originally that was set based on a benchmark in 2018 was to reduce their carbon emissions by 50% in 2022. That has not only been met, but according to them has been exceeded. The biggest thing though that Mercedes has done, which really has put them ahead of anyone else, and I think can be accredited to the fact that their massive partner and sponsor is Petronas, is that they've been deploying sustainable fuel and to counter or reduce the emissions that they've had through their flight, notably their air travel. So what does that mean? Well, they are the first global sports team to invest in this technology, also not included in the cost cap. So essentially what they're doing is investing in SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, which hasn't been deployed yet, which basically uses renewables or waste-derived material to help the team achieve a 50% reduction in their air freight footprint for their race personnel. And that is quite big. Another thing that they actually did do last year, and they're going to scale this year, is implementing their HVO 100 fuel, which they deployed in their trucks for some of the European races. They trialed this year and it went really, really well. You will have seen it on their socials or LinkedIn. It's like a big Mercedes silver truck. And yeah, they're saying that it was a massive reduction in emissions. And they're saying that that could save them around 230,000 kilograms of carbon emissions throughout the European races in the 2023 calendar, because between the European races, they can drive everything. But something to point out is that 98% of the team's logistical carbon footprint comes from its air freight. So it's air travel of around 100 personnel and 34 tons of cargo. So yes, addressing the trucks, addressing the cars, addressing the factories and all these bits and pieces is great. And if you look at the breakdown of their CO2 emissions, it still doesn't cover a massive one, which is the air freight. So it's interesting to see how that will operate and how that progresses. But essentially, Mercedes was able to reduce their carbon emissions by 60% in 2021 compared to the same period in 2018. And they've also investing in a solar PV farm, so a renewable energy generating farm, so that they're not only just renewable energy, but they're actually producing it. And that, again, you can argue the size of Mercedes and being a partner with someone like Petronas, like they are going to have some sort of an advantage there, because you're rolling out operations that perhaps Mercedes is using as a car manufacturer, that their partners are using, like their ability to drive this kind of technology. And I think that's really where, if you compare then what Williams is doing to Mercedes, what Williams is doing is even more impressive, because they have so much less people and time and resources to commit to not only devising these strategies, but actually implementing them. But yeah, it was good to see like Mercedes has done a lot and is actually trialing and pushing the boundaries. And you would think that all the big corporate backed F1 teams would do that. But based on this research, and I think based on who you find is in the top 5, that is very much not the case, which is probably the most disappointing thing about it. So that is Mercedes in a nutshell. And we will restate again, like, this is all based off what is publicly available on their own reports. It's not actually that easy to find all of this stuff. There are, and there's also, this just hasn't been a part of the conversation for a long time. So yeah, but we do the best we can, and hopefully it's interesting to you. In terms of the next team to cover, maybe we can do Alfa Romeo.
Yeah, so honestly, this is probably the most surprising team. Alfa Romeo might be the best team in terms of sustainability. And it's not actually Alfa Romeo. It is Sauber that are leading this. And I guess maybe it's not that surprising, considering they're a Swiss team and Switzerland is known for a country of great beauty and natural beauty and biodiversity. So a couple of things that they're doing is their headquarters is obviously 100% run by renewable energy on site. They offset all emissions from equipment transportations, and they offset CO2 emissions from employee flights, and they do it through reforestation and forest protection projects in Europe and in tropical areas like South America, the Amazon. They created one of the biggest photovoltaic parks in Switzerland, situated above their staff parking, and it generates enough energy to power over 40 households a year. They're renewing the company's vehicle fleet to reduce emissions. They're segregating trackside pit consumables for recycling and food waste for conversion to energy or donation to local charities. They're helping raise for more than 250,000 Swiss francs for official charities to help sustainability and reforestation and those type of programs. And so they come out and say that over 80% of the company's CO2 emissions are caused by logistics. So it's very impressive that they are offsetting all of it, because that is a big number. Yeah, and on top of that, being able to create their own energy, even though it's only for 44 households actually, it is quite impressive that they are not just reducing their own impact, but trying to provide sustainable energy for their local community as well. Again, a team not with the biggest budget in the world is really, really kind of trailblazing the way in terms of setting an example for other teams and sustainability.
So a lot of their focus is then on offsetting rather than actually reducing carbon emissions, right?
Yes. Which is, I guess, it's another path to go, because their headquarters is run on renewable energy, but not net carbon zero energy, such as other teams like Williams. Is the energy that is used in their headquarters is carbon zero. But it's clear that for them, the big goal to fighting climate change is through increasing biodiversity and kind of protecting what we already have instead of finding new ways to run their factories.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see the teams as different, like, approaches. Again, in the same way they manufacture their cars very differently. It's funny to see some creativity in terms of their sustainability approach. Now, the next team to cover is not far from Mercedes, but further from Alfa Romeo is McLaren, who I probably would say is actually the leader in this in terms of the longevity of their commitment to the cause. Well, not as long as Williams, and honestly, even just how easy it was to access the information and how much they've written on the topic and how thought out it was. So what am I talking about? Well, being sustainable is really one of the core strategic goals at McLaren, which isn't a stated case for anyone else in terms of being one of their driving, culturally key parts of the organization. And so, where did that take them? They are the first ever F1 team to go carbon neutral, and they received the FIA Sustainability Accreditation Award probably first, and they did that in 2013 and have received it for now the 9th year running. This May, they signed the Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTI. They also work with the Carbon Trust to make sure their facilities comply with ISO 14001, which requires them to have effective environmental management system. In 2010, I think this year they've become, or in the last 2 years, they've become a signatory of the UN's Sport for Climate Action Commitment, called the S4CA. And they've signed up and committed to a lot of things like this that other F1 teams, maybe they have, but it's very unclear on their website or anyone else. Like the fact that McLaren year on year has a sustainability report which outlines exactly where they want to go, the ways that they're implementing it, like that in itself shows more thought than other teams. Because frankly, if other teams had this in the current climate, they would be promoting it, right? And so in 2019, they also evaluated their carbon footprint, which was at 83, pretty much like 800, 900 tons. And the way that was broken down was very similar to the other teams in the sense that a lot of it was business travel, but actually for them, a really big one was development of materials used for the racing cars. That was 59%. 16% was other purchase goods. Yeah, but business travel is only 8%. So then in the report, what they've done is they've gone in based on all of those things that they pulled out. So business travel, production of materials, like points for each area as to how they're going to reduce that for this year. So for example, I'm not going to go through all of them, but for business travel, they said that they will continue to embrace the use of technology such as like web conferencing. So basically pushing a virtual focus for the teams and not traveling where they don't have to, which is pretty simple. But they're reviewing their business travel policies and processes, shifting from domestic and European air travel to rail where possible, which is good, while also maximizing on other alternatives. And they are exploring the viability of prioritizing airlines who use sustainable aviation fuels versus Mercedes, which are actually invested in it. They're just trying to look at people who will be using it. Fine. Nothing crazy there, but at least there are points. I mean, it's more than F1's ever done. Or like buildings. And then if you look at the creation of car engines, it says a lot about them basically starting to pick providers that are more sustainable, and a huge look into like their supply chains and how they build stuff, which again is complicated but good. And I think time will tell if they implement all these things, but it's nice to see even a plan of action, which I think a lot of other teams don't have. In terms of the impact, the team hub has cut their haulage requirement from 18 trucks to 8. So they've halved the facility's GHG footprint. So essentially what they did, I think last year or the year before, is they totally rewrote the way that they do their kind of on-site race operations, and they massively minimized it. They also changed all the halogen bulbs to LEDs, and that has saved them 13,000 kilowatts of electricity each year. And the team also utilizes the lake outside of the MTC to help control the temperature and reduce the need for cooling towers. And 100,000 trees and shrubs have been planted around the factory. So that's everything around the factory. Once again, like McLaren clearly has a big focus on this, and they've been active in it for a while, and it's very embedded into their culture as an organization, which is good to see. So it's hard to directly compare the actual carbon footprint reduction, because we're trying to deal with things that they say they're going to do and then things that they've done, and there's not a very clear like different team by different team analysis, and that's difficult for us to do without access to the teams and being able to validate everything. But yeah, hopefully it's giving you guys an idea of that carbon footprint reduction. It also makes a difference because it's different sizes of teams. So that Mercedes factory is massive, as is McLaren. You can't really compare that to what Williams are trying to do. So the actual size of the task is quite big. But I guess we can move to the next team, which is Ferrari. So Ferrari, I expected to be shit. I just didn't even expect them to make the top 5, because you just see them as like old-fashioned and traditionalist and not really with the times. Surprisingly, they weren't as bad as I thought they'd be, to the point that they're in the top 5. And I guess everyone has noticed who isn't in the top 5, hush, hush, Red Bull and AlphaTauri. So in 2021, Ferrari has the FIA 3-star, so the highest standard of sustainability accreditation. And the impact they've made so far, so 87% of the energy used at Maranello is generated, so that's their main factory, is generated by their tri-generation plant. It's the same thing that Mercedes has, with 95% of the remaining energy sourced from certified renewable sources. Ferrari's team headquarters also comply with the new Zero Energy Building Protocol, which means the energy used is approximately equal to the renewable energy that they create. So they are basically offsetting their carbon emissions. And then Maranello, along with Mugello, also has the 2016 ISO 14001 certificate, which is what McLaren also had. That just means they abide by ISO standards. So that's what McLaren has. I'm pretty sure Mercedes has that. I would assume, it's just a benchmark. And then across their European fleet, Ferrari succeeded in reducing their CO2 emissions by 35% compared to 2007 levels, despite growing significantly as a business at the time. And by the end of 2020, they hope to reduce this by a further 15% compared to 2014 levels. We don't have that's the only problem with Ferrari is I think they do stuff, but it was really difficult to find anything from them. Ferrari as an organization, as like a car organization, had a pretty extensive mandate. And I think a lot of that comes down into the F1 team. But the F1 team on its own didn't have a huge amount. So a lot of this is drawn from what Ferrari as an organization has done. And then since 2014, 100% of their electricity has been from renewable energy sources. And for what they can't offset, they've also been buying carbon avoidance credits. So, I was surprised. I didn't even think Ferrari as a car producer would have been that good. but seems that they have been investing in it, and you can see the credits of that here. So yeah, that would be the top 5 teams. So I guess now the big question is who who did the best?
Well, I think there's two teams that really stood out: Alfa Romeo and McLaren. Which is firstly, I mean, it's impressive because again, they're not the biggest funded teams; they're middle of the pack type teams. Where a team like Mercedes has much bigger resources and much bigger partners to kind of make a difference. It seems
Well,
like a team like
McLaren
Alfa
had
Romeo.
money issues a few years ago. I
Yeah.
don't think that's the case anymore.
No,
And
they're
I guess
well funded now, but they're not.
no. But I guess so you're trying to argue like relative to their size, what's the most impressive?
Well,
Because
you can argue
impact
pound to
wise,
pound. You can argue pound to pound, but I also think they kind of come out with
yeah.
the most, out of the box thinking to tackle such a serious issue.
Yeah, I could agree with that. I think in terms of innovation in the area, Mercedes is driving it. I think because they're tackling freight carbon emission reduction the most, impact wise, long term, in terms of the fact that trucks and planes and all this stuff is going to be non producing carbon emission, right? Or like carbon efficient zero, that impact is the highest. However, considering the size of them relative exactly to someone like Sauber slash Alfa Romeo and the creativity, yeah, I would agree with you that actually McLaren and Sauber display some interesting traits. I think Williams was pretty impressive. I think
Yeah,
that's who surprised me the most. It was Williams and how much
absolutely.
they actually do and how easy was it to find the information on them.
They're very open about it. It's very easy. I think the teams that are doing the most, they have a link on the front of their homepage.
Sustainability, yeah.
Sustainability. Teams that aren't,
Yeah, it's
it's a
impossible to
bit
find.
harder to track down on their websites
Yeah.
where they're talking about it. And sometimes they have a small page,
Yeah. Yeah.
Williams front dead and center, Alfa Romeo front dead and center.
Yeah, Mercedes as well and McLaren. So I guess like fifth, which hey, I think they were pretty good to make the top
Bad.
5, would be Ferrari.
Ferrari standards.
Fourth, in my opinion, would probably be based on everything we've read. I really don't want to put Williams fourth because I just
I
think,
think Williams.
but
If
is
they, if they
Williams.
become if they become carbon positive by 2030, that's something impressive achieved.
That's something no other team has.
No,
Yeah.
and I'm willing to put them above a McLaren.
Yeah. Because I think the thing is, McLaren has quite a lot of accreditations. They have a lot of structure. So, like, they have a lot of report as to why it's important and how they do it and their roadmap to be net zero by 2040 and, like, their strides in 2021. But in terms of creativity of solutions and genuine impact, yeah, I guess maybe fourth is
Yeah,
McLaren. Yeah.
Williams third,
I'm just
Alfa
impressed by
Romeo sixth.
Williams. I don't think
Yeah,
their impact is as big, but I
it's a
think
shame they can't. A shame they can't be good with their car. But yeah, second Alfa Romeo,
yeah.
first Mercedes because of the potential of what they're doing.
I don't know. I don't necessarily I think what you were saying about I mean again, Alfa Romeo's impact is very minimal, especially because there's a lot of carbon offsetting, but it's still impressive. I mean, is Mercedes first?
Well, it seems like they have. It seems like they have the most potential in what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because I think a
I
company like, I guess this is going a bit political and social cultural. A company like Petronas, a crude oil company, they must know that obviously it's not a renewable source. And if they want to maintain as a energy provider for the world, they're going to have to come up with the next thing. So they probably spend hundreds of millions in their company's research, and then they compare it and test it with Mercedes if it's feasible for cars. And if it's feasible for motorsport cars, it's feasible then potentially for everyday public transport cars.
I don't know. I actually might take back my McLaren thing. I think looking through their report again, I don't know. I think from a practicality side, and it is, for me, it's between actually McLaren and Mercedes because in terms of direct impact and how thought out it is, both of them lead. And then I think it would be between Williams and Alfa Romeo and then Ferrari last. It's somewhere there, I would say, because with how McLaren broke down each of their key areas of emissions and then created a plan to target each and has seen reduction in those, like, there's kind of direct impact. It's everything that we didn't see with F1 in terms of, like, for example, they know, most of their emissions come from logistics and travel, and yet they have no clear mandate or direct impact in terms of reducing that. Whereas the thing about McLaren and Mercedes is a lot of the policies they've put out directly impact their biggest areas of carbon emissions, which is why I think they should be at the top, because of how well thought out it is and the impact they're making. But in terms of respect level relatively, I have the most respect for Williams and then Sauber, because they are much, much smaller teams. Like, it takes time to really do this kind of stuff. So I think that's very impressive.
I agree.
What was the most surprising find for you about sustainability in F1 and these teams?
I think Alfa Romeo's, I can never remember how to pronounce the word, Alfa Romeo's photovoltaic parks situated above their car park, their staff car park at their headquarters and factories, which also provides power to over 40 households. I thought that was just very unique and interesting thing they could do to kind of help their local community, and as well as, providing energy for households. I thought kind of that was the most surprising, innovative way to tackle climate change and sustainability.
Yeah, Mercedes also have a photovoltaic, well, that's what they're investing in the plant.
What is a photo? Honestly, I've Googled it. I don't even know what it is, but it seems like it's a good thing. It's just, it sounds good.
This is where the cracks of knowledge of this podcast come through, that we can't surprisingly be experts in sustainability, diversity, and that's why we're going to bring experts on to be able to answer these questions. I think
the production of electric current at the junction of two substances exposed to light. So is it solar panel?
It's some sort of solar power plant, I think.
Yeah, parks that are solar powered.
Yeah, I mean,
exactly. Adds to my point. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, I think someone we should probably bring on is Paulo Fazer from Impact, who wrote the article on Mercedes and speaks a lot about sustainability and F1. He's probably the person to ask. But my most surprising find was that Ferrari is on this list. I won't lie. That was surprising to me.
I feel like we'll get representation that this channel is a Ferrari hating team,
But no, what actually surprised me the most is that Red Bull wasn't here. I could not find anything on Red Bull, and I looked properly. It's not because we're biased against Red Bull that I didn't look. I couldn't find, like, apart from some stuff which we'll cover in the next episode, I just couldn't find much comparatively. There was no report. They hadn't put out their statements. Like, unless they're relying on Red Bull as a brand to lead on their sustainability stuff, there was, I don't know, it wasn't super clear. And then the other key thing that I thought was most surprising, so I knew about Mercedes's sustainable fuels for the trucks, or like reduced carbon emission fuels for the trucks. I didn't know about the aviation fuels, and I think in terms of really tackling the big problem, which is the air flight and the moving of people and parts, that was the most surprising, but also the most interesting in terms of innovation in the space.
Well, I wonder statistically. I'm just posing a question. I don't have any of the information. Does, on an annual basis, and this is just globally for public transport and everything, does the total carbon emissions from flights, is that bigger than the total emission from roadside vehicles?
I think it is, but I'm not sure.
Because I know that one flight spits out a lot of bad stuff. So it would make a lot more sense if there was the opportunity to make plane fuel carbon neutral.
Well, that's why Greta Thunberg took a sailboat across the Atlantic.
Yeah. It's the fastest way of travel, though.
Yeah, Sustainability 101 by Benjamin. It produces a lot of bad stuff. Yeah, I think the least surprising fact here was that all of these teams, in my opinion, even though F1 has its 3-star accreditation, which the FIA gave it, in terms of clarity of plan of action and plan of action which reflects the problem, all of these teams have done better than F1 as an institution, which is really funny considering F1 designed these goals. I think the funny thing is, like, go ahead.
Sorry, I was reading an article and it said that it ranked all the motorsports in terms of sustainability, and number one was Formula E.
Of course.
And number two was actually Formula One, which was surprising. But then you think about their counterparts in motorsports, and the other biggest motorsports are the American series. I think IndyCar do use a biofuel.
Yeah, but I don't know what that.
But then you have NASCAR, and you look at NASCAR and you look at the target audience of NASCAR, and I imagine probably the majority of fans of NASCAR don't even believe climate change is a real thing, and they think it's a hoax from China.
That's a risky thing to say on this podcast.
So I guess the competition isn't that tough, but F1 came second to Formula E.
That's surprising though, because when we did the episode on sustainability, we did that comparison between IndyCar and F1.
Yeah.
And yes, IndyCar is much slower. Sorry, slower. I mean, it is slower, but much smaller. Much smaller. We ended up, well, what we argued was that in terms, although F1 does more technically, its emissions are a lot higher because of the global nature of it and all the air travel. And IndyCar's emissions is just lower because it's just the races and a lot of them.
And it goes back to the other thing. It's like, again, we've done an episode on this, guys, so go back and watch it if you want. And we look like statistically, like 2026 carbon neutral fuel, great. How big of a percentage of total emission of Formula One? That was like 0.8% or something.
Yeah.
80% comes from freight travels, and you look at the grid for 2023, and it's the most stupidly organized grid in the world, because they said we're going to do it regionally, but for some reason regionally it goes, we're going to go Miami to Baku, back to China, back to God knows where. And it's if you minimize the freight travel and cut down the miles by like 15%, that's a massive amount of emission cut that you could run probably all 10 of these teams' headquarters carbon neutral, and it wouldn't put a dent into, I don't know, reducing the freight travel emissions by 15%.
But that's what took away from F1's credibility in this race to be net zero by 2030 is that, and this is what everyone's argued, it's complicated to set these races, and yes, it wasn't just up to them and all these stuff, but ultimately your biggest thing, you created a calendar that just made no sense at all. So, yeah. Anyways, those are the top 5 teams in driving sustainable causes and making a dent in the cause in F1. And our next episode will be on the top 5 worst teams. See you then. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoy this content, please do follow us. We do shorts of this on our other accounts: Instagram, TikTok,
Insta.
We were big on LinkedIn. We're still going there. But if this is the kind of stuff you want, or if you have areas of impact like this, whether diversity, sustainability, entertainment in F1, careers in F1, whatever it might be, drop us a message on one of those channels, and we will aim to not only talk about it, but especially this year find experts to come and talk about it for us and for you, and really bring some insight into the sport. Thank you very much.